A middle-aged doctor sat with his feet dangling off the side of a hospital bed. For the first time in a while, he was the patient, and he was terrified. One of his friends sat beside him, holding his hand for support. On his other side, a hospital physician was focused on a long, thin tube coming out of the patient's back. The patient tried to relax and take deep breaths, but it felt like something was pressing in on his lungs, making it nearly impossible to breathe. He did his best not to panic, but it felt like he was drowning in his own body. Then the hospital physician turned on a machine, and as it began to whir, the pressure in the patient's lungs began to go away. And so the patient turned around to kind of see how it was going, and he saw there was this thick yellow fluid coming out of his back that was going up and out this tube. In over 15 years of this patient practicing medicine as a doctor, he'd never seen anything like this before. And so he turned to the hospital physician and he asked her what was causing this strange fluid to build up around his lungs. And with a look of absolute uncertainty on her face, she shook her head and said she didn't know. But she didn't have time to worry about where all the fluid was coming from. She just needed to get the fluid out of her patient before it killed him. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, be sure you go over to the Follow Button's house and rile up their brand new puppy right before bedtime. This episode is called Family Ties. Dr. Bill Linder groaned as he dragged a suitcase up the stairs of his house in Columbus, Ohio. It was June of 1990, and the 43-year-old doctor had just returned from a family trip to Israel with his 2 teenage daughters. The vacation had gone smoothly until one of their relatives got seriously ill. Bill's wife stayed behind to care for their family member while Bill and the kids returned back home. As he struggled to get his heavy luggage up each step, Bill could hear his daughters, 15-year-old Jocelyn and 16-year-old Hillary, running down to the basement to watch a movie. He couldn't believe they could keep their eyes open. After a 2-week trip, an international flight, and a long drive home from the airport, he felt exhausted. When he finally reached the upper landing, Bill headed straight to his room and collapsed into bed. But as soon as he took off his socks, he noticed his ankles looked swollen. Bill wondered if he'd accidentally injured his ankles by walking too much on vacation, but when he felt around the joints for sore spots, they didn't hurt. So Bill figured the swelling must be a result of too much sitting during the long international flight. Bill stood up and walked into his bathroom and grabbed a bottle of diuretic pills out of his medicine cabinet. He took one, hoping it might reduce the fluid buildup in his body. Then Bill crawled back into bed, desperate for a nap. Less than an hour later, Bill woke up. He still felt tired, but it was getting close to dinner time, and he knew his daughters needed to eat. So he threw the covers back and got out of bed. Bill walked out of his bedroom, intending to walk down to the kitchen, but as he stood at the top of the stairs, he started to feel lightheaded. His vision went blurry and his ears began to ring. He reached out to grab the stair railing for support, but he missed, and instead of catching himself, he fell face first into the metal rail. For a moment, everything went black. Then Bill heard Jocelyn and Hillary running up the stairs, followed by their frantic voices asking if he was okay. Bill slowly opened his eyes. He realized he was lying at the top of the stairs, and he felt this warm, wet liquid dripping down his temple. He touched the side of his head, and when he looked at his fingers, he saw they were covered in blood. He turned to his side and saw both of his daughters staring at him, their eyes wide with terror. Bill slowly stood up, holding onto the railing this time, and promised Jocelyn and Hillary that he was okay. His head was just throbbing from hitting the railing, but other than that, he felt okay. He said he must have just gotten up too fast. The girls insisted on taking Bill to see one of the doctors at his family practice. Bill didn't want to leave the house, but he figured if a quick checkup would put his daughters' minds at ease, then it was worth it. When they got to the family clinic a few minutes later, Bill could tell his colleagues were shocked to see him with dried blood caked onto his cheek. Luckily, the visit was short. The physician on duty cleaned Bill up, gave him 7 stitches, and then just sent him home. 2 years later, in the summer of 1992, Bill and his favorite nurse, whose name was Kim, were closing up the family clinic for the day. Bill had not had any more health scares since his fall 2 years earlier, so in that time he'd just been focusing on spending time with his family and continuing to expand his medical practice. Though it was getting close to dinner time, Bill did not need to rush home. His wife Rhoda was out of town, and the girls were going out with their friends. So he and Kim took their time wiping down countertops and restocking the exam rooms, chatting and drinking a couple of beers that Bill had stashed in the office refrigerator. Bill and Kim finally headed out to the parking lot at about 7 p.m. And as the two of them walked across the concrete, Bill suddenly started to feel short of breath. He'd only gone a few dozen yards, but he felt like he'd just sprinted a mile. He stood still and tried to stop panting, but inhaling just kept getting harder and harder. Kim put her hand on his shoulder and gave him a very concerned look. Bill turned to her and just said, "I need to go to the hospital." Kim sped Bill to the nearest emergency room, and when they got there, Kim helped Bill shuffle up to the front desk. In between labored breaths, he told the receptionist that he could barely breathe, but since he was a doctor, he knew what he needed. He asked to have a chest x-ray as soon as possible. Less than an hour later, Bill was lying on a hard bed in a hospital room, still struggling to inhale while Kim coached him through each breath. Finally, a radiologist entered the room with the x-ray results, and Kim helped Bill sit up so he could see. But what Bill saw on the x-ray film seemed impossible. Normally, lungs appeared dark on an x-ray, but Bill's looked white. Now, Bill was not a lung specialist, but he'd known since medical school that this was a sign of fluid building up around the lungs. In severe cases, there can be so much liquid in the chest cavity, the lungs can't inflate properly, making it difficult or even impossible to breathe. Looking at the x-ray, Bill felt genuinely frightened. Now he understood why he was so short of breath, but what he didn't understand was why all this fluid was building up in the first place. It usually only occurred in patients who were elderly or extremely sick with things like pneumonia or cancer. Bill was 45 years old and careful about his health. He watched what he ate, exercised every day. He had no chronic illnesses, and so this just didn't make sense. Bill asked the radiologist what could be causing this, and the young woman said she didn't know. They would need to run tests to find the source of the fluid. Right now, the best thing they could do was just drain the liquid out of his chest cavity using a procedure called tapping. Bill dreaded the sound of that word. He knew exactly what tapping was, but he had never thought he'd have to experience it himself. It was a crude, unpleasant procedure, and the worst part was, Bill would be wide awake for the entire thing. Half an hour later, Bill was sitting shirtless on the edge of his hospital bed, while the attending physician sat on a stool beside him. She disinfected Bill's back, then injected a local anesthetic near the rear of his rib cage. Bill's back quickly went numb, but that did not make him feel any less afraid, and so he reached out for Kim, who was still there to support him. Bill wanted to close his eyes for the next part, but he was too terrified to look away. He watched as the physician brought a long, thick needle towards his back. Then he felt a dull pressure as she plunged this needle between his ribs and pushed it deep into the space surrounding his lungs. Then the attending physician attached the opposite end of this needle to a thin tube, which led to a clear plastic container. As Bill squeezed Kim's hand and tried to relax, liquid began to drain out of his chest. Bill hoped the liquid would be clear or tan, because those were the most common colors of fluid in the chest cavity, and he didn't want to see any red tint, which could mean he was bleeding internally. But the fluid Bill saw coming out of his back and going up this tube was not clear, tan, or red. It was a thick, milky, yellowy substance that reminded him of the filling inside of a lemon meringue pie. He sat there watching this weird, gross liquid flow through the tube until an entire liter had been drained from the area surrounding his lungs. Finally, Bill felt a dull ache as the attending physician removed the needle and then covered the puncture hole with a bandage. Bill released his grip on Kim's hand and then asked the attending physician, what just came out of my body? What was that? She told him that the thick, milky fluid he was seeing was known as chyle, which is a mixture that includes fluids from the body's immune system. When a person has an infection, these fluids will flood the infected area, but they normally disappear after the infection is gone. The doctor told Bill that his body was not draining these fluids correctly, and it was causing a fluid buildup known as lymphedema. Now that Bill thought about it, lymphedema could explain the swelling problems that he had been experiencing for years. He'd thought that his badly swollen ankles a couple of years ago were caused by the long flight home from Israel, but now he realized it could be from something much worse. Because it wasn't just swelling in his legs and ankles. His body was leaking fluids into the space around his lungs, which was really baffling. His doctor agreed that Kyle should never leak into the body like this. She said she had only ever seen that happen in cases of liver failure, certain cancers, and in heart disease. When the doctor mentioned heart disease, Bill remembered something. As a child, he'd been diagnosed with a heart murmur, a tiny sound that indicated a serious problem with his heart. Bill had undergone open heart surgery to correct the murmur when he was just 12 years old. Since the operation, Bill had not had any cardiac problems, but now he wondered, could his childhood illness be connected to the symptoms he was experiencing as an adult? The physician said it was possible, but she also told him not to panic. They wouldn't be able to determine exactly what was happening until he underwent a series of tests. Until then, he should just stay calm and not jump to any conclusions. Bill promised he would try, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his heart could be failing him. Over a year later, in 1994, Bill held onto his wife's arms as she slowly lowered him into the bathtub inside their room at a Boston hotel where they had been staying for months. They were visiting the doctors who had treated Bill's heart as a child, plus many more specialists throughout the city. They were hoping to find someone who'd be able to make sense of Bill's bizarre symptoms. While Bill's wife, Rhoda, scrubbed his aching back with a sponge, Bill thought about all the tests he'd undergone. Multiple cardiologists had examined his heart, and they had all said the same thing, that it was functioning totally normally. So whatever was happening to him, it couldn't have anything to do with his heart or with the surgery he'd undergone as a child. There was also nothing wrong with his kidneys or his liver or his immune system. What's more, he didn't appear to have cancer. Based on the test results, Bill should have been perfectly healthy. But he wasn't. The space around his lungs continued to fill with Kyle, making every breath a struggle. His back was scarred from repeated tapping procedures to drain the fluid. Bill looked down at his stomach, which had become round and hard as a rock. This was a relatively new symptom, but it bothered him the most. Doctors told him that his stomach, his gut, was also filling up with Kyle, which was even more worrisome than what was happening with his lungs. There were other alarming developments too. When Bill ate, the protein and fat in his food was not being processed correctly. Instead, it was leaking out of his intestines and mixing with his blood and other fluids. These were the ingredients in the Kyle that kept building up inside of his body. As a doctor himself, Bill knew how serious this was. It meant that his body was not getting the nutrients it needed. With his wife's help, Bill climbed out of the bath, put on his pajamas, and got into bed. He closed his eyes, feeling absolutely miserable, and did his best to sleep. A few hours later, Bill woke up shivering and covered in sweat. He knew he must have a fever, so he shook his wife's shoulder to wake her up. Rhoda took one look at him and said they needed to go to the hospital right now. Bill held onto his wife as she helped him hobble out to the car, and then before he knew it, they were already at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. Bill was too feverish and confused to check in, so he collapsed into a waiting room chair while his wife spoke with the receptionist. A few minutes later, a nurse brought Bill a wheelchair and wheeled him down the hall. By the time they made it to the examination room, Bill could barely speak and his vision was blurry. He was vaguely aware of a doctor coming in to examine him, and then he heard that doctor say that Bill would need to go to the intensive care unit. Bill turned his head to the side. Through the haze of his vision, he could see his wife anxiously holding her hands in front of her chest. He tried to wave to her as if to tell her everything is going to be okay, but he was too weak to even lift his hand. Early the next morning, one of Bill and Rhoda's daughters, Jocelyn, walked through the large glass doors of Brigham and Women's Hospital. Jocelyn was now 19 years old and a college student right here in the Boston area. She'd been up very late the night before, but the moment her mom called her and told her that her dad was in the hospital, she'd gotten out of bed early and driven straight here from her dorm room. Despite her exhaustion, Jocelyn's nerves had her all wound up. She couldn't stop thinking about her father's illness, and she constantly felt anxious. She'd been skipping classes lately and partying too much, doing her best to distract herself from her dad's problems. When Jocelyn walked inside of her father's room, she saw her dad lying on the hospital bed with tubes coming out of his arms, and it made her feel even worse. He looked old and frail. She gave him a gentle hug and then sat down on the couch next to her mom and her older sister. Jocelyn's mother explained to her that her father had contracted a staph infection, which is a dangerous type of bacterial infection in the blood. He had likely gotten it during one of his many tests or fluid draining procedures. Jocelyn sighed. Her dad was already so sick, and this felt like one more health problem to add to the list. It felt like they were all just kind of waiting around powerlessly, praying for something to change. Just then, Jocelyn heard the door to the room creak open, and in walked her great-aunt, whose name was Joni. Joni lived in New York, and so the family did not see her much. But Joni skipped past the usual greetings, and instead she walked right up to Bill's hospital bed and held out a dusty 3-ring binder. Joni said she knew what was wrong with Bill. She said that she had seen all of his symptoms before in her own husband, Bill's uncle. All the proof was right here in the binder she had brought. Jocelyn nearly jumped out of her seat. Maybe Joni really was carrying the breakthrough the family had been hoping for. Jocelyn assumed her father would be excited too, but he immediately waved Joni off. He told her that the two cases were not similar at all, and so he didn't want to hear anything else about his Uncle Nathan. Confused, Jocelyn pulled her great-aunt out of the room and into the hallway and asked to look at the binder. Jocelyn realized these were her great-uncle's medical records. Nathan had died over 30 years earlier in 1961, and these documents detailed the illness that killed him. Jocelyn's great-uncle Nathan had suffered from lymphedema, or swelling, in his ankles, just like Jocelyn's father. Doctors also reported heavy chyle buildup in Nathan's chest and abdomen that needed to be drained repeatedly from his body. He'd even been diagnosed with a heart murmur. To Jocelyn, it did all sound very similar to her father's condition. When Jocelyn looked back up at her great-aunt, Joni seemed kind of apologetic. She said her husband Nathan had died a very long and painful death, and so she assumed that Bill refused to believe he might have the same condition because he couldn't bear to imagine dying the same way. Jocelyn nodded somberly, but inside, she was thinking that this information could be the key to actually helping her father. She told her great-aunt they needed to show these records to her father's doctors right away. The same day that Bill was admitted to the ICU, Dr. Christine Seidman was eating lunch in her office at Brigham and Women's Hospital. As she ate a forkful of leftovers, another doctor came inside and placed a 3-ring binder on her desk. They said it had to do with an ICU patient named Dr. Bill Linder. Dr. Seidman swallowed her food and then tucked her short black hair behind her ears. She looked over the documents while her colleague briefed her on Bill's condition. They explained the striking similarities between Bill's symptoms and his uncle's. Dr. Seidman immediately knew this case was right up her alley. In addition to being a cardiologist, she was a geneticist. Dr. Seidman knew that if anyone could solve this mystery illness, it was her. She jumped up from her desk and headed to the ICU. A few months later, in early 1995, Jocelyn sat on an exam table in the Brigham and Women's Hospital as Dr. Seidman rubbed cold gel across her skin and then pressed an ultrasound scanner against Jocelyn's chest. Dr. Seidman was performing something called an echocardiogram, or an ultrasound scan of Jocelyn's heart. The pressure of the plastic scanner hurt, but Jocelyn was too anxious about what the scan might reveal to worry about the pain. Ever since Dr. Seidman began looking into Bill's illness, she had been working closely with Jocelyn and the rest of the Linder family. Her goal was obviously to cure Bill, but to do that, she first had to identify his condition. She'd interviewed the Linder family and collected medical records going back generations, and she'd kept Jocelyn up to date on all her research, which was why Jocelyn knew how important this scan was. Dr. Seidman found that Jocelyn's father and great-uncle were not the only ones who suffered from this mystery illness. Jocelyn's great-grandmother, May, had had it too. The disease appeared to be hereditary, which meant it was getting passed down generation to generation. When Dr. Seidman had called Jocelyn in for this appointment, she explained that all 3 of Jocelyn's relatives who had dealt with this mystery illness, so her dad, great-uncle, and great-grandmother, had the same symptom first, a heart murmur. The doctors who had been treating Bill until now thought his childhood heart condition was totally irrelevant. But Dr. Seidman had discovered that it was actually the telltale sign of the mystery family disease. Jocelyn watched Dr. Seidman stare intently at the ultrasound screen. Then the doctor turned to Jocelyn, and with a pained expression on her face, she said Jocelyn did have a heart murmur. It was not a guarantee that Jocelyn would eventually develop the family disease, but there was now a very strong chance that she could. Jocelyn imagined her own body filling up with all that chyle the way her father's was, and tears began to well up in her eyes as she watched the black and white image of her heart beating on the screen. Normally, a heartbeat was a sign of life, but to Jocelyn, her heartbeat looked like a death sentence. Almost a year later, near the end of 1995, Bill sat inside of a room at the Ohio Doctors Hospital in Columbus. His condition had only gotten worse, and because doctors in Boston had not been able to help him, he and his wife Rhoda decided to go back home to Columbus. However, even though they were now closer to their house, Bill rarely spent a night in his own bed. He was almost always in one hospital or another. That day, Bill was hooked up to an IV that pumped vitamins and minerals into his bloodstream. His mystery illness had been stealing proteins and fats from his digestive system for almost 3 years, and so he now had to have this injection of nutrients twice a day in order to get the nutrients he needed. Bill looked down at his scab-covered arms from all the needles, his swollen ankles, and his huge, rounded stomach. He was in the worst shape of his life, physically and mentally. Bill knew that Dr. Seidman was trying to identify his illness and find a cure, and he had held out hope that she would. But now, he was just worried about the rest of his family. Dr. Seidman had told Bill that a total of 13 people in his family were likely to develop this disease, including both of his daughters. Now, Bill didn't only have to deal with his own horrible and confusing illness, he also had to deal with the knowledge that he might have passed it on to both of his kids. Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and a tall man with gray hair and a clean-shaven face entered. He introduced himself as Dr. Larry Lynn. Dr. Lynn sat down beside Bill's bed. He explained that he was a pulmonologist, or a lung expert, but more than that, he was obsessed with medical mysteries. He told Bill that he spent his free time digging through the hospital's records for inexplicable cases, and he'd happened upon Bill's file. Bill was skeptical. He asked Dr. Lynn how many medical mysteries he'd been able to actually solve so far, and with a smirk, Dr. Lynn replied, "Every single one." For the first time in months, Bill smiled. About 3 months later, in the spring of 1996, Bill, along with his wife Rhoda and his daughters Jocelyn and Hillary, were all clustered together on the couch in Bill's room at the Ohio Doctors Hospital. Bill looked out his window at the Columbus skyline, and he inhaled deeply. He was breathing better than he had in years, and the scabs on his arms were finally beginning to heal. He felt healthy enough to get out of bed and sit with his family and carry on an actual conversation. Bill knew these improvements were all thanks to Dr. Lynn. When he began treating Bill, one of the first things Dr. Lynn suggested was a new diet. The chyle leaking into his abdomen contained fats and proteins, so Dr. Lynn told him he would need to eat a fat-free, low-protein diet. Dr. Lynn's hope was this would make his body produce less chyle. It had only taken a few weeks on this new diet for Bill to start to feel a difference. His gut was still hard and rounded, but he could now breathe better, and he also did not have to have the fluids drained from his chest as often. Bill breathed out and told his wife and children that soon enough he'd be healthy enough to go for a walk downtown. And as he dreamed about leaving the hospital for good, there was a knock at the door. Dr. Lynn came inside and told the family he had a big announcement. He had solved Bill's medical mystery. Bill and his family all sat up, anxious to hear what the doctor had to say. Dr. Lynn said he'd been investigating Bill's illness using a brand new tool called the Internet. He'd spent hours searching for people with symptoms similar to Bill's, and eventually he found a family in Turkey with a condition that seemed identical. They'd been diagnosed with a rare disorder called Behçet's disease. Behçet's disease causes blood vessels throughout the body to swell. This leads to bodily fluids like blood and lymph not being able to circulate properly, and one potential symptom is lymphedema, just like Bill and his relatives had experienced. Bill couldn't believe it. He asked the doctor what this diagnosis meant. Was his disease treatable? Would he and his daughters be okay? Dr. Lynn nodded. He said that while Behçet's disease was rare and poorly understood, the treatment couldn't be simpler. All Bill needed were steroid injections, and he'd be good as new. Bill jumped out of his hospital bed, an IV still attached to one arm. He threw his arms around his daughters, he kissed his wife over and over, and he let tears of joy roll down his cheeks. Finally, he was going to be okay again. The following night, Bill was lying in his hospital bed, looking at the dark sky through his window. Dr. Lynn had given him a steroid injection, and he felt hopeful that the treatment would work. But suddenly, Bill felt a sharp pain in his chest, and the whole room went black. 2 days later, Bill woke up. The light in his hospital room seemed blindingly bright. As his vision focused, he saw Dr. Lin standing at the foot of his bed. The doctor's eyebrows were knitted together, and his lips were pressed into a frown. The doctor told Bill he'd gone into cardiac arrest. The hospital had been able to resuscitate him, but the emergency made one thing clear: Dr. Lin had been wrong. Bill did not have Behçet's disease, and steroids were not going to cure him. If anything, they could have made his condition worse. Bill was stunned. He'd almost died, and now he was also back to square one with a mystery disease that no one knew how to treat that also might kill him. In that moment, he suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of absolute hopelessness. 6 months later, in September of 1996, Bill's daughter Jocelyn was writing on a yellow pad working on a term paper. After spending her early college years partying and skipping class, she was now committed to getting her life together and finishing her degree. Plus, focusing on school helped her ignore the things that made her the most anxious: the knowledge that she might one day develop the same disease that was killing her father. As she scrawled on her paper, Jocelyn's phone rang. She picked it up, and she heard her mother's strained voice on the other end. She said Jocelyn's father had been placed into a medically induced coma. Jocelyn's mother explained that doctors were no longer able to drain that chyle from her father's chest and abdomen. He just had way too much scar tissue built up from years of undergoing the tapping procedure. And so now the fluid buildup was putting immense pressure on his internal organs, and they were failing one by one. Jocelyn felt tears building in the corner of her eyes. She asked her mom if this meant her father was going to die. After a moment, her mother said yes. Jocelyn swallowed hard. Her father had never lost hope that his doctors would be able to identify his condition and find a cure, but they didn't. Jocelyn wanted to start sobbing, but she did know there was one hidden blessing. Her father's suffering would finally be over. And sure enough, just a few days later, on September 25th, Bill would die. Seven years later, in 2003, 28-year-old Jocelyn was walking towards the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, California. After her father passed away in September of 1996, Jocelyn had moved far away to California, but the trauma of her father's slow, painful decline followed her wherever she went. She was acutely aware that she might meet the same fate. It was also very hard for Jocelyn to forget that she had not been there during her father's last moments. She'd flown to Columbus and gone to the hospital, but when her dad actually drew his last breath, Jocelyn had been outside smoking a cigarette. Jocelyn had a lot of regrets and painful memories. The only thing that brought her any real solace were these long walks, when she could breathe in the summer air and organize her thoughts. Jocelyn found a nice spot to sit on the bridge where she could look through the red bars to the sparkling water down below. She crossed her legs, and as she did, she noticed that one of her ankles looked much larger than the other. It had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Jocelyn remembered how her father's legs and ankles began to swell just a few years before he got really sick, but she tried not to panic. She told herself that her ankle was just aggravated from the long walk, and so she went back home that day, and sure enough, the swelling went down. But a few days later, she was at her apartment getting ready to go on another walk, and her foot and ankle were so swollen that she couldn't even get her shoe on. Jocelyn knew she could not ignore the swelling any longer, so she went to her small desk, turned on her computer, and opened up her email. She typed in Dr. Christine Seidman's address and wrote her a message asking if she should be worried about the swelling in her legs. Jocelyn finally got a response the next day. Dr. Seidman didn't say whether or not she should be worried. Instead, she offered to fly Jocelyn out to her lab near Boston. She said that in the 7 years since Jocelyn's father had passed away, she had not stopped researching her family's mystery illness, and she'd recently made a breakthrough that she wanted to tell Jocelyn about in person. The idea of going back to Boston made Jocelyn feel really nervous. She hadn't been there since her dad died. But this was very important, and so she responded to Dr. Seidman with a yes, and immediately began packing her bags. A few days later, Jocelyn walked into the tall red brick building that housed the Seidman Laboratory. She went inside and introduced herself to one of Dr. Seidman's research assistants, a young, dark-haired woman. As soon as Jocelyn said her name, the research assistant beamed. She told Jocelyn that she was so excited to see her. Jocelyn was really taken aback. She didn't even realize that the researchers would know who she was. Just then, Dr. Seidman rounded a corner and said hello, looking happier than Jocelyn had ever seen her before. Jocelyn followed her into the back of the lab, trailed by the cheerful assistant, and they all sat down in the cluttered room while Jocelyn looked back and forth at the two women, a little uneasy at how excited they both seemed. Before she could even ask what was going on, Dr. Seidman told her. She and her team had used a technology that had only just been developed, and at last, they had found the cause of her family's mysterious disease. Dr. Seidman had been painstakingly creating a map of Bill Linder's genes so that she could find anything that looked out of the ordinary. But there are hundreds of thousands of genes in every individual person, and Dr. Seidman had to build her map one by one. That's why her research had taken so long. But finally, they'd found an extremely rare mutation of a single gene that had caused Bill's illness. It was a lot like finding a needle in a haystack. The chances of a single defective gene leading to such a debilitating illness were about 1 in a billion. Even more surprisingly, Dr. Seidman concluded that no one in the world outside of the Linder family carried this mutation. Dr. Seidman discovered that the genetic mutation began with Jocelyn's great-great-grandmother, Esther, who first showed symptoms of the disease roughly 100 years earlier. That made Esther what disease trackers call patient zero, the first patient with a brand new disease. Since Esther, this mysterious condition had been passed down 5 generations. Once Dr. Seidman found this genetic defect, suddenly Bill's illness made more sense. The mutation stopped his liver from being able to properly filter toxins out of his blood, and from there, it caused a cascade of serious problems, including the chronic swelling and the chyle buildup in his chest and abdomen. Lastly, the genetic mutation also appeared to cause the family's telltale heart murmur. Jocelyn was on the edge of her seat as she heard all this. She asked Dr. Seidman if now they'd be able to cure her, her sister, and her other relatives who had likely inherited this disease. But Dr. Seidman shook her head sadly. She said, while this was a huge discovery, many questions still remained. I mean, at this point, they didn't even have a name for this disease, and so they really had no way to treat or cure it, at least not yet. Jocelyn felt totally deflated. Even though they had just figured out what was behind the family's deadly illness, there was nothing she could do about it. Over the last 20 years, Jocelyn has come to terms with her diagnosis. Because the risk of passing on her deadly genetic variant was so high, Jocelyn and her husband chose not to have kids. Her older sister Hillary opted to use a form of in vitro fertilization that allowed her to have twins who were both free from the family disease. Right now, in the 6th and newest generation of the Linder family, there are 23 children. But due to advances in fertility treatment, none of these new generation kids have the genetic mutation. The Linders were able to stop the spread of their family illness. Today, there are 7 members of the Linder family who do carry the genetic mutation who are still alive. Dr. Seidman and her team continue to research their illness in hopes of someday finding a cure. In 1989, 23-year-old Duncan McPherson pulled his little red car into a parking lot inside of a lush green valley in Vienna, Austria. After parking his car, Duncan reached across his middle console and he grabbed an apple out of a bag, and then he took a bite and just admired the unbelievable landscape all around him. He was near the Austrian Alps, and so there were literally just mountains jutting up everywhere. Duncan, who was originally from Canada, had been this highly touted, unbelievable first-round draft pick by the New York Islanders back in 1984. The Islanders are a professional ice hockey team in the United States. But despite Duncan's incredible promise and athleticism, he just couldn't ever get it together, and so he never actually made the New York Islanders' big league roster. And so, in 1989, Duncan started to realize that maybe his hockey career was coming to an end. But instead of just hanging up his skates in frustration, Duncan decided he would pursue a different type of career that kept him still within the hockey world. He would become a coach. And so, in 1989, Duncan had agreed to coach this small-time professional hockey team in Scotland. And for Duncan, his thought was, I'll go there, I'll learn how to be a good coach, and then down the road, I'll maybe have the opportunity to coach much more prominent and prestigious teams.
But before moving to Scotland and beginning this new career, Duncan decided what he really needed right now was just to take a break. Because for basically his whole life, Duncan had been playing hockey around the clock practically 7 days a week. You don't get to become a first-round draft pick unless hockey is your life. And so Duncan thought, you know what, before I begin this huge life transition, I'm gonna just kick back and relax and go on a huge European vacation. And one of the first stops of this vacation was going to be the Austrian Alps right in front of him. However, he wasn't just going to look at these incredible mountains, he was going to snowboard down them. Or more specifically, he was going to learn how to snowboard on these incredible mountains. And so Duncan finished eating his apple and then chucked the core into the bag. And then he hopped out of his car, shut the door, locked it, and then began walking across the parking lot towards the white gondola station. A gondola is like a ski lift, but much bigger. It's kind of like a small bus with lots of windows, and it's connected to a cable, and that cable, which is elevated off the ground, pulls you up and down mountains. Now, typically, people ride gondolas just for the incredible view of the mountain from up high. But some gondolas are actually in place to take people to specific locations in the mountain. And typically these locations are areas that are not accessible otherwise. You need a gondola to get there. And in Duncan's case, the gondola that he was about to hitch a ride on was of the latter variety. It carried passengers from the station near this parking lot high up into the Austrian Alps, up to about 10,000 feet of elevation, where there was another gondola station called the Eisgrot Mountain Station. And right next to the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station was a very unique ski resort called the Stubai Glacier. And overwhelmingly, this ski resort was the reason why people were taking this gondola. This ski resort was unique not only because it was very hard to get to, you basically had to take a gondola or hike up to it, but also because the actual slope that skiers and snowboarders would use at this resort was not just a snowy mountainside like virtually all other ski resorts around the world are. No, instead, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort was a glacier, and so people were literally skiing and snowboarding on a glacier, hence the name. And a glacier, in simple terms, is just a huge swath of thick, permanently frozen ice. And so, in the warmer months, when other ski resorts around the world were not able to continue operations because there was no snow, or it was too warm to make snow, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort did not have that problem. Because, in those warmer months, they could just drive their huge snowcat tractors with their big rakes behind them all over the slope, the glacier, and their rakes would basically chop up the top layer of the ice, turning it into powder for people to ski on, which allowed them to basically stay open every day of the year. And so, Duncan, back down in the parking lot, he walked over to the gondola station, he bought his gondola ticket, and then he hitched a ride on the first gondola that swung through the station. And after a slow but beautiful ride up into the mountains, where all that lush greenery down below in the valley was replaced by jagged snow and ice up in the Alps, Duncan finally saw the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort and the glacier itself right behind it that stretched up to the top of the mountain. A few minutes later, the gondola Duncan was on arrived at the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station, and Duncan, along with the others inside of the gondola, hopped off, and then Duncan immediately walked over to the resort and headed into the equipment rental store. And after getting his snowboard and his boots and all the other equipment he would need, he headed right back outside to wait for his instructor to arrive. Duncan had previously purchased a lesson with an instructor at the resort. It was set for 11 a.m. And so Duncan, he's out there at the foot of this glacier, and right at 11, an instructor walks over and introduces himself, and Duncan and the instructor immediately start getting into the basics of snowboarding, how to put your boots into your bindings, how to use the edges of your board. And then for a little while, the instructor and Duncan didn't go up the glacier. Instead, they just kind of worked on some basics on the flat ground right there. And then after the instructor felt like Duncan was ready to go, they both walked over to the tow rope, which is a way to get to the top of the slope. There's a cable that kind of rotates from the top to the bottom of the mountain, and there are all these bars attached to the cable, and skiers and snowboarders grab the bar while standing on their snowboard or their skis, and they literally get pulled up the mountain. And so Duncan and the instructor grabbed onto the tow rope, they made their way to the top of the glacier, and from there they pushed over to the start of the run. And once they were there, the instructor strapped into his snowboard, and then Duncan strapped into his, and then they were off. Very slowly making their way, kind of like a falling leaf pattern. Duncan was not just going straight down the mountain. He's a beginner. And so it's very slow, very controlled. And as they went down, the instructor's giving Duncan tips, how to stay more on his edge, how to slow down, how to speed up. And very quickly, the instructor saw that Duncan was so good at balancing, his legs were so strong, likely because he was a professional hockey player. And so the instructor was telling Duncan the whole time they're going down how unbelievably good he was doing for his first lesson. And so finally, after about an hour of very slowly making their way all the way down this glacier, they reached the bottom where they had first been doing some flat ground stuff. And when they got there, it had started to rain. And it was raining bad enough that lots of people on the mountain were abandoning the mountain and running inside of the resort to get out from under the rain. And so the instructor, he looked at his watch and he realized they were almost at 1 p.m., which was the end of their lesson. And he said to Duncan, I don't think we have time to go back up. Plus it's raining. Duncan said he didn't care about the rain, but he also understood that, it wasn't ideal conditions. And so they decided that even though there was a few minutes left, they would just cancel the lesson right there, and they would actually just go inside and grab lunch together. And so they made their way out of the rain into the resort, and when they went inside the resort, the instructor noticed that Duncan's sweater, which was underneath his yellow rain jacket, was totally soaked. And so he offered to Duncan, hey, do you want to take your sweater off and I'll hang it up inside my office? And, by the end of the day, it should be dry. And Duncan thought, great, that's fine. So he took off his wet sweater, he gave it to the instructor, and while the instructor was going to his office, Duncan went into the gift shop and he just bought a new sweater for the day. And after that, Duncan had his new sweater on with his rain jacket over it, and then he met the instructor in the cafeteria, where they both sat down and had a nice meal. They got to know each other a little bit better. After they were done eating, both of them looked out the window and saw the rain had subsided, but in its place was lots of fog that was rolling in, and so very few people were going back onto the mountain. But the instructor told Duncan that, hey, you did so good today that you should really go back out there on your own this afternoon and practice. Do some runs, go nice and slow, same as I was teaching you. And then tomorrow, when we have our follow-up lesson, we can maybe, get into some more advanced things. Duncan thought that was a great idea. He said he would definitely go out there and practice on his own. And then the two men cleaned up, and the instructor made his way to meet his next client, and Duncan headed right outside, grabbed his snowboard, and began walking towards the tow rope. The next morning, Duncan's snowboard instructor arrived a little bit early to work. And so after getting off the gondola, he made his way over to the resort and he grabbed a cup of coffee in the same cafeteria where he and Duncan had eaten the day before. And then after finishing that coffee, the instructor grabbed his snowboard and the rest of his gear and then headed outside to meet Duncan in the meeting spot they had both agreed on. But when it was time for the lesson to start, Duncan didn't show up. And so the instructor for a second thought, was there somewhere else we were going to meet? Did I get the time wrong? But he checked the time and he remembered the conversation he had with Duncan. They were going to meet at the foot of the tow rope and he was right there and Duncan wasn't. And so he thought, okay, maybe Duncan's running late. But he waited and waited and waited and Duncan never showed up. The instructor was bummed because he and Duncan really had kind of become friends the day before and he was looking forward to teaching Duncan some more today. But the instructor knew it was pretty common for tourists to cancel their follow-up snowboard or ski lessons. It's like they show up for that first day, they get really into it, they plan on going the next day, but then other distractions in their vacation pull them elsewhere and they no-show for the lesson. And so the instructor didn't take it personally. He just assumed that, Duncan had found something else to do that was more fun. But the instructor knew he would see Duncan again because Duncan's sweater was still sitting in the instructor's office. 1 week later, Duncan's parents, who were back home in Saskatoon, Canada, got a very unexpected phone call from the Dundee Tigers hockey team, which was the professional hockey team in Scotland that Duncan was going to go coach after this big European vacation. The team rep for this hockey team asked the parents if they knew where their son was because he had not shown up for his first day of work. And Duncan's parents, they immediately were like, that doesn't make any sense. He was so excited about this job. This is a really big deal for him. He would never miss the first day. And so the parents told the team rep that they would try to get in touch with Duncan, and as soon as they did, they'd be in touch with the team, and the team rep said they would do the exact same thing for the parents. However, after this call, the parents quickly realized that trying to get in touch with their son was going to be nearly impossible. They knew Duncan had gone on this big European vacation, but they didn't have his itinerary. They didn't know what countries he was going to, in what order. They really only knew that he was really excited and he was just going to be on vacation. That was kind of it. And remember, this is 1989. They can't just call Duncan. There weren't cell phones. They didn't have the easy modern ways that we all communicate instantly. And so the parents are like, who do we even call? Where do we go? What do we do? And so ultimately, even though this felt kind of dramatic at the time, the parents decided to file a missing person report with Interpol, which is an organization that connects police across international lines. However, the parents quickly learned that this missing person report was not going to become a high priority item for any police anywhere in Europe, because their son was 23, he's healthy, he's strong, he's smart, he's of sound mind, and really all that had happened was Duncan had missed a single day of work on the back end of a huge vacation. So there's lots of reasons why that could have happened. Maybe he extended his vacation. Yeah, it's not professional, but it's totally possible. Or maybe he doesn't want to take the job after all. Or maybe he's just running late. I mean, there's a lot of very logical explanations for why Duncan didn't show up. And so, in short, the parents were told that if you want to find your son right now and not just wait for him to reappear, well, you better go looking yourself. And without hesitation, that's exactly what Duncan's parents did. They packed up a couple of suitcases and they headed to Europe to go find their son. Because to them, it felt like something was wrong here and there was no time to waste. But again, the parents have no idea where their son would have gone in Europe. And so they don't really have a good starting point. They don't know who to talk to, but they just began chasing down every single seemingly insignificant lead they came across. And as they traveled all over Europe, they hung up thousands and thousands of flyers that showed their son's face, said he was missing, and here's a number to call if you know where he is. But despite these efforts, the parents really got nowhere. That is, until about a month into their search, when still they have not found Duncan, they have no idea where he is, they've chased down all these leads, they've all dead-ended, and at this time, the parents convinced several news outlets around Europe to air a segment on their news about Duncan. And one of those missing person segments aired in Austria. And the news anchor in Austria, when they were doing the segment, they described the car that Duncan was almost definitely driving when he went missing. It was that little red car. The parents had discovered in chasing down their leads that their son had borrowed the little red car from a childhood friend who used to play hockey with him, and the friend had told the parents that he had lent it to Duncan, and Duncan had told him he would have it for a week and then return it. But Duncan had never returned the car. And so the anchor in Austria does this segment about how Duncan is missing, and if you have information, come forward. They describe the little red car, and sure enough, not long after this segment aired in Austria, somebody found Duncan's car. It was still sitting in that parking lot right near the Stubai Glacier gondola. Immediately, when Duncan's parents heard about this, they flew to Vienna, Austria, and they met with police who brought them out to look at their son's car. They hadn't moved it. It was still just sitting where he had left it. And then also police showed the parents what they had found inside of the car, which included Duncan's passport, a letter to his girlfriend, where he talked about how excited he was to go to Scotland, and also a bag of rotten fruit. The police also told the parents that now, with the discovery of this vehicle, they were going to really lean into this missing person case to try to find their son, and that the next day they were going to launch this huge search of the area near where his car was to hopefully find Duncan. And so the parents, who were now cautiously optimistic that they might get some answers, they left the police and they went to a local hotel to rest up before the next day when they would be up early and join this huge search party. But when they got to that local hotel, they did what they always did everywhere they went in Europe. they began handing out all these missing person flyers with Duncan's face on them to everybody they saw in the lobby. They began hanging them up all over the hotel. And sure enough, just by completely random chance, they handed one of these flyers to Duncan's snowboard instructor. They handed it to him, he looked at it, and he did a double take, and he was like, I know him. And he explained how he taught Duncan how to snowboard, and then Duncan didn't show up the next day, and he just figured, okay, he blew it off to go do something else, but he'd come back for his sweater, but he never came back for his sweater, and he never heard from Duncan again. And so the parents, they have been searching all of Europe for a month, and they haven't talked to anybody who knew Duncan. They've gotten nowhere, and now they've just randomly stumbled on probably the last person to see Duncan before he went missing. And so they kept asking the instructor, give us more information. What was his attitude like? Was he stressed out? Was he scared? Was he worried about something? Where did he go? Give us anything. But the instructor really didn't have that much more information to offer, and so he tried to answer all their questions, but really just finally said, look, I'm sorry, all I know is after we ate lunch together on the 9th, Duncan said he was going to go out and do some practice runs, but I never actually saw him go up. I didn't see him come down. I just assumed he went up there and was kind of on his own for the day. And then, of course, the next day, I didn't see him, and he never came back, and so I'm sorry, that's all I know. And so the parents finally said, thank you so much for the information. Please get in touch with us if you remember anything. And the instructor said he would. And then after that, the parents made their way to their room and they went to bed. The next morning, the parents got up early and they headed to that parking lot where Duncan's car was. And there were all these people, police officers and volunteers that were there to be a part of this big search party. And so after the parents explained to the leaders of the search party what the instructor had told them, that very likely their son had been up at the Stubai Glacier ski resort when he went missing, the entire search party quickly hopped on gondolas and made their way up there. And all day, this search party combed this glacier up and down. They walked all around to the backside of this mountain. They rappelled down cliffs and they hiked all over this entire segment of the mountain. But nobody found anything that gave away where Duncan had gone. And the next day, it was the same story. Huge search party looking everywhere, expanding the search, not just Stubai Glacier, but basically all over this entire swath of mountain range. But still, they found nothing. And so, at the end of the second day, the authorities went up to Duncan's parents and they told them that, unfortunately, we can't continue this search. We're calling it off. But Duncan's parents, they didn't call off the search. They continued searching for another 14 years. And over that time frame, they went back to Stubai Glacier over and over and over again. They searched it up and down. They knew all the staff members. They knew all the nooks and crannies of the entire place. But they never found any sign of their son. Fast forward to July of 2003, so 14 years after Duncan had gone missing. And a Stubai Glacier ski resort employee was riding the tow rope towards the top of the mountain when they noticed there was a bright yellow piece of trash right in the middle of the slope. And so the employee rode the tow rope just a little bit higher, and then he let go and skied down to this yellow thing. He reached down and he began pulling on this piece of yellow, and suddenly he stopped. And absolutely horrified, he realized this was not trash. While no one knows for sure what happened to Duncan, here is the leading theory that Duncan's family and authorities, for the most part, agree on. Back on August 9th, 1989, after having lunch with his snowboard instructor, Duncan was feeling motivated to go back out and take some practice runs. And so he headed outside, he looked up at the glacier, there's all this fog rolling in, but it's not raining, and so nobody's on the slope, and so it's perfect for a beginner. He's going to have this place to himself. And so he grabs his board, he makes his way over to the tow rope, he straps in, he grabs onto a bar, and he makes his way to the top. Once he gets off, he makes his way over to the start of the run, he puts his other foot into his binding, he makes sure he's all set, and then he stood up and began slowly kind of waffling his way down the completely vacant and very foggy slope. And as he was going along, he got more and more confident and began going a little bit faster and a little bit faster until finally he was basically just bombing it down the mountain, relying on his natural balance and strength to kind of keep him up. And then all of a sudden, he caught an edge and flipped forward and smashed into the ground. And when he did, he broke his leg. The unique danger to humans when it comes to glaciers is something called a crevasse. Basically, cracks form in the ice, and sometimes these cracks can be massive, like mind-bogglingly massive, hundreds and hundreds of feet, that if you fall into this thing, you're done. No one's getting you out of there. You are falling either to your death, or you're falling so far down that no one can get to you. Or, like in the case of Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, they had the issue of little crevasses forming kinda all over the place. Especially if it rained, the rain would begin to crack the ice, or if maybe it was warmer than usual, the ice would crack here and there. And so the resort was really good about constantly patrolling their slope to make sure no crevasses had formed anywhere on the slope. And so when you got to Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, you were warned that there is such a thing as a crevasse. This is a real glacier, so make sure you're looking around and don't fall into one. Well, because it had rained, a crevasse had formed, a small one, like a pothole, in the slope, but because it was so foggy because of the rain, as Duncan was bombing down, he didn't see it, and that's what he caught his edge on, causing him to fall and break his leg. And so Duncan, he's now stranded in the middle of the slope. He's not close enough to the bottom to where he could pull himself into the resort. He's not close enough to the top where he could get himself up there and talk to the tow lift operator. And so he's just kind of stranded. There's nobody on the mountain. It's so foggy, nobody can see him from the resort. And so he's just stuck in agonizing pain, wondering what he's supposed to do. At the same time this was happening, another ski resort employee was climbing into one of those big snowcat tractors at the top of the glacier. These tractors were what the resort used to chop the top layer of ice and turn it into snow. And because it had rained that day, a lot of the snow had melted, and so this employee needed to basically go over the entire slope from top to bottom and grind up the ice and make some new snow.
Laughter echoed in the air, love was everywhere. Windows fogged on rainy days. In your arms I'd lose my gaze. Whispers in the twilight glow, we never let it go. Take me back to where we danced, where love had its perfect chance. Hold those moments close and true, in that place where I found you. Stars above lit up the night, shared our dreams in moon soft light. Even shadows felt so bright, we were each other's light. Letters written, love confessed. In that place we were our best. Promises in every sigh, together we could fly. Years may pass, hearts may roam, but that place we'll call it home. Love's sweet echoes never fade. In our hearts they always stay.
And so the employee hopped in the cab of this tractor, shut the door, turned on the engine, turned on the back rake, which in your head, picture a long stretch of metal dragging behind this tractor that had rotating blades that cut into the snow as it moved along. And so this employee, after turning on the rake and making sure everything worked, they drove the snowcat and the rake onto the start of the downward slope, and they began crisscrossing back and forth across the entire slope, turning it all into fresh snow. And as this employee drove, they were very careful not to go too quick because they knew they couldn't see very far with all of the fog. And so they're going like 1 or 2 miles an hour, being very cautious. And then suddenly, at the last second, they see something in the snow. It kind of appeared out of the fog. And so the employees swerved as fast as they could to avoid hitting it. And they did narrowly miss it. Their big tank-like treads that are on these tractors just missed running this thing over. However, the back rake with the rotating blades did not miss this object. It went right over it. The employee immediately parked the snowcat and then leapt outside and ran over to see what this thing was. And when they got there, they could not believe what they saw. It was Duncan, and all those rotating blades that had crossed over him had basically mutilated him. One of his arms had been cut off, one of his legs was nearly cut off, but it's believed Duncan was actually not dead. The injuries were horrible, but they would not necessarily have killed him outright. He would bleed to death without help, but in theory, he could have been saved. But the employee, even though this was a total accident, totally panicked and decided that because it was so foggy, no one must have seen this. No one was around, and so no one would know that they were the ones who ran this guy over. And so, instead of helping Duncan, they just tied him up and dragged him behind the snowcat off of the glacier over to this area where this employee knew there was a very deep crevasse. And they chucked Duncan, who might have been alive at this point, into the crevasse along with his arm and his severed leg, and then the employee used the snowcat tractor to rake over the crevasse. They filled it all in and packed it down, and then they drove down the rest of the way and just hoped no one would ever know. But over the course of the next 14 years, the glacier would melt more and more each year until finally Duncan's yellow jacket popped through the ice. And that's what the resort employees saw as they were going up the tow lift and thought it was trash. It was actually Duncan's jacket. They skied over, they tried to pull it out of the snow, only to then see, literally in the ice, Duncan McPherson looking right back up at them. And Duncan still looked like he was 23 years old because he had been frozen this entire time. According to the Stubai Glacier ski resort, Duncan must have just fallen into this crevasse and died. That's what they say happened, and some authorities say that is what happened. But when they pulled Duncan out of the ice and they found his body had been chopped apart and his snowboard had even been chopped apart, that told a very different story. As for the snowcat driver who drove over Duncan, they were never actually officially identified or charged with any crime because there was a statute of limitations that had run out by 2003. And so no one has ever been held accountable for Duncan's death.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Those are MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts, and you will find all of them. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the one you listened to today, but in video format on our YouTube channel. And our YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. Go check it out. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time.